My name is Irina Viljanen. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Aleksanteri Institute, and I'm chairing this session. And I'm happy to introduce you our visiting fellow, Tatiana Bukina, who is an associate professor at the Vaganova Ballet Institute, musicologist, and she will be presenting her a presentation of her manuscript of a monograph that is about the first decade of Soviet musicology, and she's focused on sociological direction in musicology. And Tatiana Bukina is an author of 80 publications, including 3 monographs. So she has a quite career behind her, and she has been doing her research for several years on this topic. So you are welcome to ask questions after her presentation. We have she will first have 45 minutes of her talk, and then we will have 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So you can start.
Irina, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and I also would like to offer my thanks to the Aleksanteri Institute for making this visit possible. Despite all the pandemic restrictions, despite all organizational difficulties you faced even nowadays. So it's very valuable for me, and I highly appreciate it. Thank you so much. So, dear colleagues, thank you so much for coming. And in my today talk, I would like to familiarize you with my research, the ultimate goal of which is completing a monograph that is named Sociology of Music in Post-Revolutionary Russia as a methodological and political project. And this research is based on results of my long-time work on exploration of Russian musicology of various periods, in fact, in a frame of what I have been interested primarily in connection between historical, cultural, and institutional conditions of development of this discipline on or some particular research direction within it on one hand, and the conceptual content on the other hand. And my address to the 1920s in this book is determined by the fact that firstly, it was in its own way a unique culture, incredibly interesting for study, and secondly, that Russian musicology in many respects can be considered as a product of that culture. So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that musicology as a research specialty was formed in Russia in the early post-revolutionary years. So I don't mean by this that there was no publication on music until the revolution, or that musicological subjects were not taught anywhere. The first works of the academic level in theory of music emerged in Russia as early as at the turn of the 19th century. And there were several periodicals on music, and the major of them was the Russian Musical Gazette. You can see it on the next slide. So how it looked. It started to issue in 1894, as you can see. So at conservatoires, theory of music took an important place in the curriculum, but only as a part of the education of composers and performers. And up to the 1920s, there was no educational institution in Russia where musicology was taught as a specialty and as a research profile. And as for publication of that time, there were not yet any pronounced differences between academic discourse and journalism. And most branches of musicology were quite poorly supplied with specialized literature in Russian, both original and translated. And only a few foreign publications were really available even in St. Petersburg and Moscow, let alone other Russian cities. The contemporaries complained a lot about that. And the institutionalization of musicology as a scholarly humanitarian specialty happened at the beginning of the 1920s in the frame of special organizations, research institutes. They were founded in Russia after German model and actively started to spread after the revolution. In Petrograd, in the field of arts, it was the Russian Institute of Art History. So you can see the photos on the next slide. So it was founded really in 1912 and had in this structure a department of history of music. And in 1921, this institute got a status of research institution. And in November of the same year, 1921, two more research institutes that contained musicological profile were founded in Moscow. The first one was the State Institute of Music Science, and the second one, the State Academy of Artistic Science. And you can see the photo in the right part of this slide. So that means that this year we can celebrate the centennial anniversary of my specialty in Russia. In the academic field of the 1920s, musicology became a poster child of the revolutionary discipline. So it's highly innovational level and an incredibly broad circle of research interests, an inspiration to widen all the time its purview and engage new methods and fields and specialists as well. All these properties are inherent to so-called expansionist strategy in scholarly work, if to use a typology of Inna Spiegel-Rosing, a German theorist of science. One of the original traits of musicology of that time was its propensity to sociological vision of musical phenomena. Here, sociology of music didn't occupy any local detached niche within the structure of musicology. It rather was a complex discourse that to a certain extent affected almost all directions and fields of music scholarship. Many of the most striking achievements and findings of musicology of that time were in some way or another related to applying sociological optics in their works. Getting familiar with the musicological heritage of the 1920s, I became increasingly convinced that a systemic address to sociological approaches didn't just enrich a thematic repertoire of the specialists, but profoundly affected the very algorithms of their research thinking, both general viewpoints on the issues under consideration and technologies of their exploration. However, in works devoted to the given period, the role of this research field in the development of Russian musicology is evidently underestimated and hasn't been realized nowadays. There are several reasons for this. One of them is often insufficient explication of the sociological base in the musicological works of that time. In other words, the specialists didn't always call sociology what they were doing. And it creates an additional challenge in the research because sociological view in their legacy sometimes need to be reconstructed on purpose. And the second, even more important reason is certainly ostracism. The sociological knowledge in general and its particular branches as well were exposed to for political reasons at the turn of the 1920s and onward. Over the next several decades, musicologists consistently dissociated themselves from any connection with sociology, and all manifestations of sociological thinking in works were stigmatized with ideological cliché, vulgar sociologism, vulgarный социологизм. Remarkable that this refusal from sociological view ultimately decreased the innovational level, the innovational potential of Russian musicology. And nowadays, it's a rather traditionalist discipline, unfortunately. And from this position, it's hard to esteem adequately the real significance of sociological discourse for musicologists of post-revolutionary years. The main points I put forward in my work state that firstly, mastering of sociological approaches played a crucial role in the process of institutionalization of musicology in Russia. This period got major support from the state in the post-revolutionary period. Secondly, sociological vision deeply affected the paradigm of early Soviet musicology, even when the specialists didn't overtly declare that. Thirdly, sociological view determined some of the most path-breaking aspects in musicology of this period, having allowed making it in full measure the revolutionary discipline. Firstly, mastering of sociological approaches also helped the musicologists find ways of applied use of their knowledge and thereby prove their value for the state. Such a statement of the problem led me to consider the post-revolutionary sociology of music as a project closely integrated into a whole network of professional strategies and initiatives of the musicologists who were highly motivated to achieve a high status in the Soviet academic field. The important methodological guidelines in my research were in particular field theory by Pierre Bourdieu, methodology of history of ideas, a concept of trading zones of Peter Galison, a concept of culture one by Vladimir Paperny, and so on. So in accordance with these tasks, in the first part of my work, I examine historical circumstances and factors that affected the development of sociology of music in post-revolutionary Russia. In particular, in my opinion, a significant context for that was the situation of so-called deinstitutionalization of science. Yes, if to use a term of a theorist of science, Boris Yudin. So this deinstitutionalization included a number of facts destructive for so-called normal science, such as destroying academic infrastructure, the collapse of academic communities, resistance from the side of the old specialists. Many of those didn't accept the revolution, emigration or death, sometimes of some authorities in science, and also acute financial shortage. All these organizational anomalies ultimately caused transformation in the academic knowledge itself, shattering disciplinary frames as well as boundaries between science and non-science. On the one hand, many of authoritative in the past disciplines, especially humanitarian, such as history, philology, law, they just lost the state support. On the other hand, it created potential niches in the academic field for some new specialties. No wonder that it became a time of intensive emergence of new directions and even disciplines in Russian science, such as behaviorism, reflexology, eugenics, pedology, geophatic theory, some direction of psychoanalysis, etc. And their representatives, as a rule, tended to dissociate themselves from the previous generation of specialists and emphasized a revolutionary character of their work, as well as their solidarity with social and cultural changes in the state. However, apart from innovational character, there were some other criteria of what made a scholarly work accordant to the socialist epoch. In particular, the head of the Prolet Cult organization, Alexander Bogdanov, asserted that every research period, regardless of the subject, implements a certain social ideal because it embodies some mental habits inherent in a social class or social order that created this period. Following that, he suggested a concept of the proletarian science that was characterized by the following features. Creating knowledge close to practice and collective experience, clear to working class people and demanded in everyday life, and also simplified terminology. Then, a spirit of collaboration embodied in particular via friendly relationships between various research fields, free exchange of methods and concepts, and permanent interaction between research and practice. Bogdanov relentlessly reminded that all the breakthroughs in science were usually made at the intersection of branches. Then, an interest in fundamental scientific laws and methods integrating various disciplines, an aspiration to create a some united scholarly language. And in education, teaching students rather about methods of getting knowledge and critical thinking than about ready information. And also ideals of comradeship in scholarly research, a collaborative work at collective projects according to preliminary worked out and negotiated plan. And in professional contexts, mutual respect, democracy, and openness to everyone's ideas. All these criteria were undoubtedly very significant and guiding for young Soviet musicology. The revolutionary spirit of the musicologists of the given period was evident in their publications. They were definitely aware of their missions of builders of history and asserted to be created their discipline from scratch. The music scholarship in Russia is beginning with us, and its future depends on the success of our work. It's what Alexei Finagin wrote in 1922. The musicologists were also very critical about the merits of their predecessors. They constantly opposed themselves to conservatoire and complained about its routine and dogmatism of teaching. And a fundamentally new achievement of their own institution, as they stated it, was a forming of a united research school and a collaborative work at large-scale project according to the general plan. And they also reckoned that their immediate task was elaborating new methods to be guided by when creating new knowledge on music. So all this testifies that the musicologists in full measure felt like representatives of the new revolutionary scholarly mindset. And it's worth noting that musicology at that time had real prerequisites for realization as a proletarian science. One of them was a unique confluence of research forces there. So in the absence of profile education in this field, the first generation of musicologists was recruited of specialists who came from related social and humanitarian disciplines. So it needs to say that foundation of the Art Research Institute coincided in time with reforms in humanitarian education at Russian universities. So in 1921, the government introduced so-called general scientific minimum on Marxist disciplines, such as, for instance, historical materialism, it was the proverbial Istmat, political economy, political order of Russian Federation, and so on, several very difficult subjects. And in addition, all humanitarian specializations the same year were integrated into the United Faculty of Social Sciences that had a pronounced political bias. In comparison to universities, research institutes in the early 1920s still possessed relative political freedom that attract humanitarians to work there. The result of this was their amazing interdisciplinary contingent of specialists who got a brilliant education in pre-revolutionary Russian or European universities and mastered several foreign languages. These specialists often felt like inheritors of intellectual tradition of the Silver Age and a part of the world academic community. So, on the next slides, in this table, you can see data on education of some important pivotal figures in musicology. So you can see their names, information about the places where they got their higher education, then about their specialty. So you can see that there are no musicologists among them. Years of getting education and foreign languages. I think that the most exceptional figure was Ivan Solertinsky, who even wasn't able himself to say how many languages he mastered. But as you can see, 4, 5, or 7 languages, it was normal for humanitarians of that time who came into musicologists in the 1920s. So, very outstanding figures. Yes. Another important factor was that the most researchers were working in different professional fields at the same time, and such practice wasn't voluntary for them. Due to permanent financial shortage, the most positions in other research organizations were not supplied with salaries. Sometimes it's even difficult for us to believe, but the most of musicologists didn't get any salary for their research work at that time. And certainly it forced them to combine several workplaces. They usually labored at other research institutions, sometimes of different profile, also in libraries, museums, theaters, or concert organizations, and often worked also as educators or journalists. In other words, they really possessed universal skills and a great practical experience, what was necessary for proletarian science. So in many respects, due to these circumstances, musicology was functioning in the 1920s as a kind of trading zone. Yes. So this term was introduced by American theorist of science, Peter Galison. He comprehended the academic field through an anthropological prism and called in this way intersection between several isolated scientific and sometimes not scientific subcultures. And according to his conception, in the trading zones, the members of these subcultures are forced to seek a common language and negotiate just in order to trade. And such context substantially intensifies the process of rethinking and transforming knowledge. And in musicology, such trading zones emerged even on several levels as an interdisciplinary dialogue and as its openness to interaction with a broader field of culture. And that was underpinned by the sincere willingness of the most of the specialists to contribute to the contemporary culture building. Despite all of that, to become a truly revolutionary, musicology needed some breaking through research project, able to lead this discipline to a qualitatively new level. During the 1920s, musicologists suggested several scenarios of such revolutionarization. However, in my opinion, the sociological one proved the most viable and the most productive among them. And as I hypothesized, the main reason for this was that at that historical moment, it was sociology of music that let both noticeably extend the heuristic potential of musicology that meant to make it scholarly, and simultaneously prove its helpfulness for the state that meant to make it applied. Sociological knowledge enjoyed a remarkable state support in post-revolutionary Russia, owing to the ongoing at that time process of building a new society and a new mentality, so-called the Soviet man. The concept of the new man was also in many ways inspired by the prolet cult, and in the next years, many other politicians contributed to it. If to summarize the ideas, this type of personality in no way came down to easily swayed and suggestible mass men. Its prominent features were an extraordinary level of creative energy and charisma, the need to live by collective interests, a joyful attitude to the world, a strong sense of duty to the society, self-discipline, systemic thinking, and critical thinking. Over time, political leaders, as early as the prolet cult activists, became increasingly convinced that it was impossible to create the new man directly through ideological pressure. For instance, Lev Trotsky in his publication reflected upon the role of everyday human experience in forming personality. So there was an evident demand in post-revolutionary Russia for exploration of human mentality and the ways the cultural environment could affect it, as well as for study the general logic of the society development. As far as art was supposed to play a significant role in making these changes, sociological aspects of art, including music, also drew a great interest of politicians, in particular Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was in charge of people commissar of education, the Minister of Education, in fact. Yes, and he wrote a lot on these issues. Many musicologists kept an active touch with him. And in addition, most of them, as I have already mentioned, were working in the social sphere and therefore had to seek some approaches to their audience. In that period, the art culture of Russia faced a global tectonic shift. A marginal in the recent past strata of the proletarian audience started to lay claims for leading positions, and the musicologists were supposed to reflect upon these new cultural realities and learn how to deal with them, how to rule them. Along with that, the researchers had also a purely cognitive interest in sociological discourse, proving more clear understanding of relationships between music and society. This discourse gave the keys to posing and solving a broad range of problems in history of music. It may be said that a close connection between purely cognitive, theoretical, and historical aspects on the one hand, and applied pragmatic tasks on the other hand, was one of the striking traits of musicology of music or sociology of music in Russia of the 1920s. The phenomena described on historical material immediately found application in their practical projects. Remarkably, that a conceptual base of the authors, due to their extraordinary humanitarian erudition, was significantly broader than the official Marxist paradigm. Among the important sources, they were, in particular, pre-revolutionary Russian School of Historians, yes. Then Russian Formalist School of Literary Criticism, and also works of contemporary European musicologists, as you can see on this slide. In the meantime, it's infamous that in its official version, sociological knowledge in Soviet Russia was a highly politicized sphere and a mechanism of ideological control over research. It created certainly a particular challenge for the researchers who strove to achieve in their works a compromise with the state political cause without a loss in heuristic value. Now, I would like to consider several examples of how sociology of music affected the conception of musicology. In my work, I dedicate to it the rest two parts, in particular in theory of music. In theory of music, sociological view provided a new perspective on its traditional objects, elements of musical structure and musical language, revealing their social and historical conventionality. A great example of this we can observe, for instance, in a famous monograph by Boris Asafyev, Musical Form as a Process, the first volume of which was created in the second half of the 1920s. A basic conceptual point of this work was an emphasis on a dynamic side of music, as opposed to the generally accepted approach that dealt with the static aspect of it, the components of musical structure. Asafyev considered form-building parameters of music as a system of oral guidelines that regularized a live sound stream in the listener's consciousness. And he pointed out that these guidelines underwent historical modifications along with changes in the audience mind. Thus, the development of oral perception throughout history became a leading criterion in the selection of elements of musical formation. And in parallel with Asafyev, his Moscow colleague, Boleslav Yavorsky, in his article, The Basic Elements of Music, drew attention to differences in modal systems and senses of modal tension in different national cultures. And he hypothesized about the existence of indirect correlations between a model organization in music and the structure of society where this music was created. In the same years, a former Asafiev student and economist by training, Roman Gruber, presented a cycle of articles where he proposed to apply toward music economic concepts and terms. And he set a task to place under the common denominator socio-economic and artistic phenomena. He disclosed a range of unexpected analogies between artistic and economic realities. For instance, he strove to ascertain a correlation between aesthetic and economic value of the artwork, between laws of art production and commodity production, between art consumption and economic consumption. This and other similar experiments of his colleagues have much in common with the technology, our contemporary technology of discourse analysis. So in Soviet musicology, it was tested first almost 100 years ago. The musicologist also strove to rethink methodological aspects of history of music on the sociological base. For instance, Asafiev, in his article of 1924, suggested a new object of this discipline. He represented historical development in music as a process of unfolding in time a certain international material. He called it the sounding substance. And afterward, he proposed instead of this term, another term, intonation fund of the epoch. And this fund, according to Asafiev, accumulates all musical experience of the time and crystallizes in the creative heritage of the composers. The historian has to reconstruct in all possible entirety this ulterior for direct observation process and ascertain regularities that rule it. As a key to understanding these realities, Asafiev considered an exploration of what he called everyday musical experience. And as far as he headed the musical department at the Institute of Art History, he and his colleagues founded some special structures that collected material on contemporary musical life, because they intended to supply the future historians with necessary material about their own epoch. So they had an ethnographic committee there and also had a committee where the members recorded street sounds, such as songs, some instrumental tunes, and even sometimes even shouts of traders and beggars. So yes, on this page, you can read a quote from account of Roman Gruber. He was the head of this committee, and he wrote here that at the moment they possessed more than 60 records of different intonations of people such coal sellers, bakers, sellers of ice cream, fruit, vegetables, mops, lemons, and also blind beggars and so on. They were very proud of this collection. And in 1926, the collaborators of the same structure of the department, musical department in Leningrad, also issued the first in Russia collection of translated articles on jazz. You can see its cover here on this slide. In fact, it was the first academic edition on jazz, not only in Russia, but even in world practice. The whole collection of articles. So it was a very important edition. Yes, and they considered jazz certainly as a very important element of musical experience of their own time. Then, in the article of the 1927, Asafiev suggested the term locus of listening to music that he considered as a basic characteristic of a historical epoch. In his understanding, it was a kind of institute of performing and perception of music that included places where this music sounded, the cast of performers, norms of the listener's behavior, etc. Apart from that, his student and the follower, Semyon Ginsburg, who also was a historian by training, also wrote about a necessary for this specialty skill of what he called a congenial reception of music. Or in other words, it was a skill to hear music with the ears of the contemporaries. So having laid stress on the reception of music, Ginsburg thereby brought up an issue that will attract a sustained interest in the last third of the 20th century in the frame of reception studies. So why all these findings in history of music are so important? We need to understand that before that there were no any developed methodology of history of music in Russia. So the authors only mentioned some facts of biography of composers, they numbered their works, and analyzed something of their music, and it was all. Yes. So such an intensive work at the methodological and conceptual base of the discipline was combined by the musicologists with no less vigorous practical endeavor. Remarkably, that Asafiev during this period left a tremendous legacy in the field of children education and also education of adult people. And there he flexibly adapted to this sphere his own theoretical concepts. His and some of his colleagues' works provide evidence that the musicologists of that time strove to contribute to the project of forming the new Soviet man. So they tried to find some application of their theories. In particular, Asafiev asserted that a musical practice, both passive and especially active, develop in human personality two sides equally demanded by the current historical moment. First of them is leadership traits, such as initiative, organizing skills, critical thinking, and ingenuity in new circumstances. These properties are being intensively formed in the process of observation of music, a special perception strategy that is trained on a school discipline listening to music and characterized with an utmost awareness at every moment of sounding. Abstract and temporal nature of music, Asafiev asserted, impose special requirements to concentration, intuitive understanding of musical logic, and foresight, and all these abilities were of high demand in contemporary life. The second side is social skills, such as collectivism, discipline, and voluntary submission to work of a united and a harmonious social organism, in particular, a singing choir. In his works, Asafiev agitated for organizing amateur choirs at schools and factories, and in his opinion, a massive suggestive impact made by music disciplines people and non-violently engages them into cooperative labor. It's worth noting that such observation and conclusions of Asafiev in many respects anticipated our current researchers in the field of art therapy and art pedagogics. So contemporary specialists come up to them only nowadays. It might be concluded that in the 1920s, sociology of music was a large-scale and complex project that affected all basic fields of musicology and substantially determined its paradigm. In sociology of science, there is a notion about two major ways to institutionalize a discipline or research direction, a cognitive and a social. And the analysis undertaken here reveals that advancing of sociology of music in significant measure allowed the musicologists to implement both of them, relatively speaking, to create the discipline and to invent the society, and having approach by that to the idea of the revolutionary knowledge. All right. Thank you to everybody for your opinion.
Thank you, Tatiana, for very, very interesting presentation.